The night was alive with noise, though inside the bar it carried a rhythm of its own. A jukebox in the corner played an old country tune that skipped faintly on the chorus. A cigarette haze hung thick over worn tables, and the smell of spilled beer clung to the air like a stubborn ghost. This was Danny's Tavern, a place that wore its reputation openly. It wasn't written on the sign above the door, but everyone in town knew what it meant. This was a cop's bar, their bar. Outsiders, especially those who looked like they didn't belong, rarely stayed long. Two brothers pushed the door open that Friday night. They weren't loud, didn't stumble in the way drunks often did, and made no attempt to draw attention. They were clean-cut, their shirts plain, their boots scuffed but sturdy. Their presence, however, was enough. Heads turned. Conversations slowed. Eyes tracked them to the empty booth near the back wall. They sat down side by side, ordering quietly, their voices calm against the bar's restless din. Daniel and David Thompson had the kind of bond only brothers could share, though in them it ran deeper still. Twins. Same height, same broad shoulders, the same steady way of looking at a man until he looked away first. Life had taught them to communicate without words. A glance, a shift in posture, and entire conversations passed between them, invisible to outsiders. When their beers arrived, they lifted them casually, almost in unison, taking small sips as though they had all the time in the world. To anyone watching, they might have seemed simply tired men seeking a moment of rest. But not everyone watching saw them that way. Three figures peeled away from the bar, their boots tapping against the wood in deliberate rhythm. Off-duty police officers, though that didn't strip away the air of authority they carried like armor. They moved like men who believed the space they occupied was theirs by right. The first was tall and broad, a permanent sneer carved into his face. His name was Brett Coleman, and in that dim light, his eyes glittered with the kind of disdain that sought out a target before a word was even spoken. Behind him walked Rick. Torres, lean, sharper in the face, the kind who followed orders but carried enough sense to hesitate. The last, younger than the others, was Jack Morrison, flushed with drink, his grin sloppy and dangerous. They formed a half-circle around the brothers' booth, shadows stretching across the table. The jukebox crooned on, but the words no longer mattered. Every patron nearby had gone quiet. A few shifted uncomfortably in their seats. They knew the pattern. This wasn't the first time. Brett leaned down, planting his palm against the scarred wooden table. His voice was low but carried easily through the room. "You two ought to finish up and leave. Place like this?" He paused, his grin widening. "Ain't meant for the likes of you." Daniel didn't lift his eyes from the bottle he held. His calm was deliberate, honed over years of moments just like this. "Is there a problem, officer?" His tone was steady, quiet enough that only those nearest caught the words. That tone made Brett bristle. It wasn't defiance, but something worse. It was composure. He'd come looking for unease, for the flicker of fear he was used to finding. Instead, he got measured calm. Rick shifted on his feet, his gaze flicking from Brett to the brothers. Something about them tugged at the back of his instincts, but he said nothing. Jack, on the other hand, let out a sharp laugh, the sound cutting and ugly. "Don't play dumb," he slurred. "You don't belong here. This bar's ours, our ground. You hear me?" David finally looked up, his dark eyes meeting Brett's with an intensity that didn't waver. There was no challenge in them, no anger either, just the heavy weight of a man who'd endured this script too many times before. His voice was low, even softer than his brother's. "We're just having a drink." It should have been simple enough. A drink, and then they'd leave. But simplicity was never the goal for men like Brett Coleman. He leaned in closer, his breath reeking of whiskey. "No. You'll leave now, and you'll be grateful we're letting you." Daniel's grip tightened on the neck of his bottle, not in threat, but in memory. He was 15 again, standing on a street corner with David when a patrol car pulled up. The officer who stepped out had asked the same kind of question, dripping with the same suspicion. "These bags yours, or did you steal them?" School bags. As if carrying books was proof of guilt. They had lowered their heads, done what was asked, swallowed their pride. That memory had never left. It lived in his chest, heavy as stone. Now, decades later, he was no longer that boy. He finally raised his eyes to meet Brett's. "We'll finish our drinks," he said, calm but unyielding. "No trouble. Then we'll leave." The response only stoked the fire in Brett's chest. He slammed his hand flat against the table, rattling glasses. A hush swept through the bar. Even the jukebox seemed to fade. "You'll leave now," Brett barked. "On my word, or you'll regret it." David slid a hand into his pocket, moving slow, deliberate. Every officer's eyes tracked the motion, but all he pulled free was his wallet, setting it gently on the table. His tone was cool, detached, but his words carried weight. "Maybe we should see some identification. Make sure you really are what you say." The drunk one, Jack, laughed, but his laughter cracked halfway. "You trying to be funny? You think you can talk to us like that?" His finger jabbed toward David, shaky and clumsy. "This is our city, our rules." Daniel leaned back slowly, his posture straightening. His voice, when it came, was firm for the first time. "Interesting choice of words. Your city." Brett shoved him hard against the booth. The sound of wood scraping against the floor echoed through the silence. Every eye in the bar locked on them now. Behind the counter, the bartender, Luis, froze with a glass in hand. His knuckles whitened around it before he quietly set it down and reached for his phone. David's jaw clenched, but he rose at the same time his brother did. Their movements were seamless, as though rehearsed. Though the truth was, they didn't need rehearsal. They had always known how to move together. The twin brothers stood tall, their shoulders squared, their presence suddenly larger than the narrow booth that had confined them. Shirts stretched over frames that spoke of strength, not flaunted, but earned. They weren't men built by gyms and mirrors. They were carved by years of discipline, training, and hardship. Daniel spoke, his voice carrying through the stillness. "We're leaving, but you'll regret this night more than we ever could." Brett laughed, though it rang hollow. "Big words. Let's see if you back them up. Outside. Now." Jack grinned, his drunken confidence bubbling up again. Rick didn't smile. His gut twisted as he watched the brothers step toward the door. There was no hesitation in their stride, no stumble, no rush. Men who didn't fear what waited for them. Men who walked as if the outcome had already been decided. At the door, Daniel paused, turning back just once. His words weren't loud, but they cut through the heavy silence like a blade. "Last chance. Walk away now. Apologize, and this ends here." Brett puffed his chest, refusing the out. "Or what?" The faintest curve touched Daniel's lips. Not a grin, not mockery, but patience. Dangerous patience. The kind held by a man who knew exactly how far he could go. "Or you'll find out too late." The door swung open, spilling yellow streetlight across the floor. The twins stepped out into the night, shadows stretching behind them. The officers followed close, arrogance pushing them forward, unaware that the ground beneath their boots was shifting. Inside, the bar exhaled. Conversations returned in whispers. Luis, the bartender, kept his phone in his hand, finger hovering over the call button. He didn't know what was about to happen in that lot outside, but he knew one thing with certainty. Nothing about this night would be forgotten. The night air outside was thick, warmer than it should have been for the season. The hum of distant traffic mixed with the buzz of the neon sign above the bar, flickering with a faint electric sputter. Out here, the music and chatter were gone. The lot was wide, gravel crunching beneath boots, shadows spilling across the asphalt from a single broken lamp. Daniel and David stepped into the open space, the door closing behind them with a thud that seemed to seal their fate. They didn't speak, didn't look at each other. They didn't need to. The brothers had been in this place before, not this exact lot, but this tension, this smell of impending violence, this moment where choice was stripped away. The officers followed, swagger in their steps, the kind of confidence bred not from skill but from years of unchecked power. Brett Coleman was first, shoulders squared, jaw clenched. His eyes burned with the satisfaction of a predator who believed the hunt already won. Behind him, Jack stumbled slightly, laughter spilling out between words slurred with liquor. Rick Torres trailed just a step slower, his instincts gnawing harder than they had inside. Something in him whispered that this wouldn't play out the way Brett thought. The lot fell quiet. Even the night seemed to hold its breath. Daniel turned, his boots grinding against the gravel. His posture was calm, his expression unreadable. David mirrored him. The same subtle tilt of the chin, the same calm, measured breath. They stood as one, two silhouettes beneath the broken lamplight, their shadows stretching long across the ground. Brett's voice cut through the silence. "You think you can walk in, sit where you don't belong, talk back to me in front of my people?" His fists clenched, veins rising along his forearm. "You don't know who you're dealing with." Daniel's reply was soft, but it carried. "We've been dealing with men like you our whole lives." The words hung heavy, thicker than the humid air. David stepped slightly forward, his eyes fixed on Brett. "Last warning," he said, voice calm, almost gentle. "This doesn't have to happen." Jack laughed, waving his hand sloppily. "Listen to them, acting tough. Think they're heroes or something." "Come on, Brett, shut them up already," Brett sneered, spitting to the ground. "Heroes?" His eyes narrowed. "Nah, they're just cowards hiding behind their little act." He moved first, lunging at Daniel with the reckless confidence of a man who thought brute force was enough. His fist cut through the air, aimed for Daniel's jaw. But Daniel wasn't there. He slipped sideways, fluid, controlled, and in the same motion, his palm struck Brett's chest. Not hard, not brutal, just enough. Brett stumbled back off balance, shock flashing in his eyes. David's voice broke the silence, calm but cutting. "You don't want this fight!" Jack charged next, drunk strength pushing him forward, fists flailing wild. He swung at David, sloppy, desperate. David caught his wrist mid-air, twisted it just enough, and Jack dropped to one knee with a cry, his body folded under the weight of his own recklessness. David released him gently, letting him crumple to the gravel. Brett roared, fury boiling past reason. He came again, this time with both fists, a storm of blows meant to overwhelm. Daniel met each one, not with equal force, but with precision. A block here, a step back there, a controlled strike that redirected momentum. Within seconds, Brett was breathing heavy, sweat glistening on his forehead, his power wasted against the steady patience of a man who had trained for storms far greater than this. Rick Torres finally moved. Not drunk, not sloppy. His stance was sharper, his fists raised with the discipline of a man who had boxed before. He circled, eyes never leaving the brothers. He saw the way they moved, the fluidity, the calm. They weren't ordinary men, and that realization chilled him. "Brett," Rick warned, his tone lower, urgent. "Back off. Something's wrong here." But Brett wasn't listening. He swung again, teeth bared. Daniel caught his arm mid-motion, twisted, and in a blink, Brett was face first against the hood of a car, his arm pinned behind him. Daniel leaned close, his voice barely above a whisper. "This is your last chance. Walk away." Brett struggled, his pride screaming louder than the pain in his shoulder. "You," he grunted. "Don't give me orders." Daniel released him suddenly, letting him stumble free. He didn't pursue. He didn't need to. David helped Jack to his feet, steadying him only to let him collapse back against the car, groaning. "You're drunk," David said flatly. "Go home before you hurt yourself worse." Rick's fists lowered slightly. His gut twisted tighter. He studied the twins, how every move was calculated, efficient, how not a single strike had been more than necessary. They weren't thugs. They weren't street fighters. They were trained. Military, maybe. Something even sharper. Rick took a step back, voice cutting into the night. "Brett, enough! We're not winning this." But Brett's pride was deafening. He spat blood to the ground, his eyes blazing. No, no way I'm backing down. Daniel's face shifted, patience thinning. His voice hardened. You should have listened inside. We didn't come here for trouble. But trouble came looking. For a heartbeat, silence reigned. The hum of the neon sign, the whisper of wind through the lot. And then Brett lunged one last time. It ended fast. Too fast for Jack to process. Too fast even for Rick's trained eyes to follow. Daniel sidestepped, his arms sweeping with controlled force. Brett hit the ground flat on his back, the air driven from his lungs. David stepped forward, placing one boot gently against Brett's chest, pinning him without crushing him. The younger officer's drunken grin was gone now, replaced by wide-eyed fear. Rick stood frozen, torn between loyalty and the sharp edge of reality. Daniel looked down at Brett, voice low, steady as stone. This isn't your city. It doesn't belong to men who think fear makes them kings. Tonight you learn that. Brett's rage broke then, not because of the pain, but because of the truth in the words. He could hear it in the silence of his fellow officers, see it in the way Rick didn't move to help him. His pride, the thing he wore like armor, cracked in that gravel lot under the weight of two men who refused to bow. David stepped back, lifting his foot away. Brett gasped, coughing against the night air, his chest heaving. The twins didn't advance. They didn't strike again. They simply stood, still and calm, as though they had weathered the storm and now waited for the thunder to fade. Rick finally spoke, his voice softer, almost respectful. Who are you two? The brothers shared a glance, brief but heavy with unspoken words. Daniel answered, his voice measured. Men who've seen enough to know when pride's about to destroy someone. Walk away, officer. Take your friends with you. Rick's jaw tightened. His pride wanted to argue, but his instinct, his survival, won out. He reached down, pulling Jack to his feet, steadying him as the younger officer groaned. Brett sat up slowly, fury and shame warring on his face. The lot was silent, save for their breathing. The fight was over. But the lesson was only beginning. Daniel and David didn't move until the officers began retreating. They didn't gloat, didn't smirk. They simply watched, silent, steady. When the last of their figures slipped into the night, the brothers finally turned, walking side by side back toward the darkness. Neither spoke a word. They didn't need to. Behind them, the gravel lot felt heavier somehow, as though it had absorbed the weight of a truth no one inside that bar would ever forget. The night didn't loosen its grip after the fight. The gravel lot still carried the echo of boots, the quick breaths of men who had learned too late that arrogance has a cost. Daniel and David walked on, the hum of the neon sign fading behind them, their silence speaking louder than any words could. They didn't look back. Though they knew the officers would remember every detail, the calm in their movements, the certainty in their eyes, the restraint that made the humiliation cut deeper. The twins had not come to win a fight. They had come to end one, and they had. Back inside, the bar remained hushed. Word had already spread among the patrons who'd watched the officers follow the brothers out. The bartender, Luis, stood with his phone still in hand, thumb hovering but never pressing call. He had seen enough in his years to know when something important was happening, something larger than the nightly chaos his tavern usually hosted. Tonight had not been about a brawl. It had been about a reckoning. Outside, the officers regrouped near their cars. Jack slumped against the door, still groaning, his drunken haze evaporated by fear. Rick leaned heavily on the hood of his cruiser, his eyes fixed on the ground, the weight of realization pressing into his chest. Brett stood apart, fists trembling not from pain but from humiliation. His jaw was clenched so tight it looked as if his teeth might crack. Rick finally broke the silence, his voice measured. We should have walked away inside. You saw it. They weren't scared of us. They weren't even angry. They knew exactly what they were doing, Jack muttered, his voice weak. They're just two guys, Rick shook his head. No, they're not just two guys. His eyes lifted, staring into the distance where the brothers had disappeared. You felt it, didn't you? The way they moved. They weren't fighting us, they were teaching us. Brett spat to the gravel, fury still burning. Teaching us? Don't twist it, Rick, they embarrassed us. That's all, but his words rang hollow, even to him. Because deep down he had felt it too. Every strike had been controlled, every motion precise. The brothers had been in command from the first moment, yet they had chosen not to destroy him when they could have. That restraint was worse than any beating. Inside, Luis whispered to a patron near the counter. Those two? They weren't regular men. You could see it in their eyes. Men like that, they've been through storms most of us can't imagine. And he was right. As Daniel and David walked down the dim street, the silence between them stretched long but never heavy. It was the silence of understanding, of two lives lived in parallel, marked by the same scars. They didn't need to revisit the fight. They knew what it had meant. Daniel broke the quiet at last. His voice was low, almost reflective. They'll tell themselves a story about tonight. That we just got lucky. That we were tough enough to hold our own. David nodded slightly, eyes fixed ahead. But when they lie awake later, they'll remember the truth. What truth? Daniel asked, though he already knew the answer. That fear doesn't bow to a badge. That respect can't be forced. And that some men can't be broken by intimidation. Daniel's lips curved faintly, not in a smile, but in agreement. They walked on, the glow of street lamps painting long shadows at their feet. With every step, their past followed, memories of times when standing their ground hadn't been so simple. Times when they had been younger, powerless, forced to endure the bite of prejudice in silence. Times when the weight of authority had crushed them simply because they had no voice loud enough to resist. But tonight had been different. Tonight, they had been the voice. Back in the lot, Brett finally slammed his fist against the hood of his car. The sound cracked through the stillness, startling Jack. His voice was ragged, torn between anger and shame. They're nobodies. You hear me? Nobodies. Rick's eyes narrowed. He shook his head slowly. No, Brett, they're the kind of men you should have thought twice about before picking a fight. He paused, his tone sharper. And the kind of men you'll think about every time you walk into a room from now on. Brett didn't answer. He couldn't. The night stretched on, each man left alone with the reflection of what had happened. And though none of them would say it out loud, the lesson had been carved into their bones. Strength wasn't in fists or badges or threats. Strength was in the calm of two men who could have crushed them but didn't need to. Later, in the quiet of a diner a few blocks away, Daniel and David sat across from each other, coffee steaming between them. The fluorescent lights buzzed overhead, the hum of an old refrigerator filling the silence. David stirred his cup slowly, his eyes thoughtful. You think they'll change? Daniel leaned back, exhaling. Maybe, maybe not. Men like Brett, they carry their pride like a shield. Sometimes it cracks, and they rebuild it stronger. Sometimes it shatters, and they finally see. David's gaze drifted to the window, watching the empty street outside. And if it doesn't? Then it doesn't matter. Daniel's tone was steady. Because tonight we showed them something they can't unsee. That power doesn't belong to men who take it by force. It belongs to those who hold it and choose not to use it. David nodded, the weight of the words settling between them. He thought back to their childhood, the countless moments of humiliation, the nights spent wondering if life would ever change. Tonight felt like an answer, not just for them, but for everyone who had ever been told to bow their head and accept less. For a long time, they said nothing more. Just the clink of coffee cups, the hum of the lights, the quiet presence of two brothers who had faced the world together and refused to bend. When dawn came, the city stirred awake, but the memory of the night remained. In Danny's tavern, the story spread. Whispers of two brothers who had walked in quiet, stood tall and left stronger men humbled in their wake. Patrons told and retold the details, each time with the same awe. Not of violence, but of control, of discipline, of the quiet dignity that spoke louder than fists. For Brett, the shame lingered. Every time he looked in the mirror, he saw not just his own reflection, but the calm eyes of the man who had pinned him down and let him rise. Jack avoided the tavern for weeks, his laughter gone, replaced by silence whenever the story resurfaced. Rick alone carried something else from that night, not shame, not anger, but respect. A quiet respect he never voiced, but that changed the way he carried himself from then on. And for the twins, life moved forward. They didn't seek recognition. They didn't tell their story. They simply lived as they always had, quietly, firmly, unyielding. But they knew that in that gravel lot something had shifted. A line had been drawn, because sometimes the greatest battles aren't won by breaking your enemy. Sometimes they're won by showing him you never needed to. The story closes not with the sound of fists or the crack of violence, but with a voice, a calm, steady narration, echoing the lesson of the night. Strength isn't measured by how hard you can strike, but by how much you can hold back. Respect can't be forced through fear, nor demanded with a badge. It's earned quietly by men who stand when the world tells them to kneel. And when arrogance meets restraint, when hatred meets discipline, truth always wins. The camera fades on the brothers walking side by side into the rising dawn, their silhouettes long against the light, leaving behind a city that would remember them, even if it never knew their names.